My name is Thomas Whitfield and I am 75 years old. 2 months ago, my son hosted a barbecue for a group of his college friends who were in town for a reunion weekend, and I stopped by briefly to drop off some folding chairs he'd borrowed from me the week before. As I set the chairs down near the garage, I heard him through the open kitchen window, mid-conversation with several of his friends, telling them, with a kind of easy, dismissive laugh, that his father had basically been a failure his whole life, someone who never amounted to much beyond a forgettable government job, and that he'd spent his entire childhood watching me fail to build anything worth talking about. His friends laughed along. What my son didn't know, standing in that kitchen making that comment, was that the forgettable government job he was describing had been a 28-year career in the United States Army, one that ended with me retiring as a full colonel, decorated for actions that, to this day, some of the men I served with still speak of with a reverence I've never fully known how to accept gracefully. If you've ever had your entire life quietly dismissed by someone you raised, in front of people whose opinion clearly mattered enormously to him, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my son wrong. It's about what happens when decades of deliberate, careful silence finally, unexpectedly, comes apart in front of the very people it was meant to spare from ever having to understand its full weight. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened once my son finally learned the truth. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that barbecue, because otherwise the word failure won't carry the specific weight it's supposed to carry in this story. I enlisted in the Army in 1968, 18 years old, straight out of high school in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, at a moment in American history when a boy from a town like mine didn't have many choices about whether he'd eventually find himself involved in that particular chapter of our country's history. I served 2 tours in Vietnam as a young enlisted man, before being selected for officer candidate school, a path that would eventually shape the entire remaining arc of my career. I want to tell you about a specific action in 1970, during my second tour, that matters enormously to understanding everything that followed, though I want to be honest up front that I've spent 55 years finding this particular memory difficult to discuss in any detail, even now, even in a story like this one. My unit was conducting a reconnaissance operation in terrain that our intelligence briefings had significantly underestimated, both in terms of enemy presence and the specific tactical difficulty of the ground itself. We made contact with a considerably larger enemy force than anyone had prepared us for, and in the chaos that followed, I found myself, as the senior enlisted man present after our lieutenant was wounded early in the engagement, making decisions that fell well outside my formal rank and training at the time. I remember the specific sound of that afternoon, a particular quality of heat and humidity that made every movement feel heavier than it should have, and I remember the moment our lieutenant went down, a wound that left him conscious but unable to command, his eyes finding mine, with an expression that communicated, without words, that responsibility for what happened next had just shifted entirely onto my shoulders. I had perhaps 3 seconds to process that shift before the next round of enemy fire forced any further reflection into pure, immediate action. Over the following several hours, I coordinated a fighting withdrawal that brought every member of my unit home alive, including 4 wounded men I personally helped extract under sustained enemy fire. Decisions made with incomplete information, under conditions that left very little room for error. Decisions that I still, even now, occasionally revisit in my mind, wondering whether some different choice might have produced a different outcome, even though I know, rationally, that the outcome we achieved that day was about as good as circumstances allowed. I remember specifically the weight of the third man I carried, a young private whose leg wound had left him unable to move under his own power, and I remember the particular strange calm that settled over me during that final extraction, a kind of narrowed, functional focus that I've never fully been able to explain to anyone who wasn't present that day. I received the Distinguished Service Cross for that action, the second highest award the Army can bestow for valor in combat, a decoration I've kept in a drawer for over 5 decades rather than displayed anywhere visible in my home. Because I've never been entirely comfortable with the idea that a medal adequately represents what actually happened in that particular stretch of jungle, or fully honors the one man from my unit who didn't make it home from that engagement. A private named Curtis Boyd from Georgia, 20 years old, whose name I still say quietly to myself every March, around the anniversary of that day. Curtis had a girlfriend back home he talked about constantly, a girl named Ruth who he planned to marry the moment he returned, and I've thought, more times than I could ever count across the following 55 years, about the life he never got to live, weighed against whatever recognition the Army eventually gave me for surviving the same engagement that took him. I stayed in the Army after that engagement, receiving a battlefield commission that eventually led to formal officer training, and I built the remainder of my career, over the following 26 years, primarily in operations and training command roles. Work that, by its nature, rarely translates into the kind of stories that make for easy dinner table conversation, but that shaped, in quiet, largely invisible ways, an enormous number of the young officers and enlisted men who eventually served under commanders I'd trained. I retired in 1996 as a full colonel, having spent the final decade of my career running a specialized training program that focused on decision-making under extreme pressure, teaching young officers the specific, hard-won lessons I'd learned in that jungle in 1970, lessons about maintaining clarity and function when every option in front of you carries genuine cost. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. I never discussed the specifics of my combat service with my own family, not in any real detail. This wasn't because I was hiding some deep shame or trauma I couldn't face, though certainly some of what I carried from those years was genuinely difficult. It was more than anything a deliberate choice, made early in my career and maintained across the following decades, to keep that particular chapter of my life separate from my role as a husband and father, a boundary I maintained partly out of the particular reticence common to men of my generation who served in that specific war, and partly because I genuinely believed, at the time, that shielding my family from the weight of those memories represented a kind of protection I was capable of offering them. I met my wife Linda in 1974, several years after my return from Vietnam, at a dance held for officers and their families at the base where I was then stationed. She had a particular gift for reading a room's emotional currents that I never quite matched myself, and she understood, almost immediately upon meeting me, that whatever I'd carried home from that war lived somewhere I wasn't prepared to fully share, not out of any distrust of her specifically, but simply because the weight itself resisted easy translation into ordinary conversation. She knew, in general terms, that I had served in combat and received significant recognition for it, but she respected, throughout our 46 years of marriage until her passing 4 years ago, my preference to keep the specific details largely private, an act of patience and trust I've thought about often in the years since losing her. We raised one son, Marcus, born in 1980, and I want to be honest that raising him while continuing an active military career, followed by decades of what he understood only as vague, unexplained government work, created a particular distance between us that I don't think either of us fully addressed until very recently. I remember specific moments across his childhood, birthday parties and school events I attended in civilian clothes, never in uniform, deliberately keeping any visible reminder of my military identity separate from the ordinary rhythms of his upbringing, a choice that felt, at the time, like reasonable discretion, but that I understand now, looking back, probably contributed directly to the particular thinness of his understanding of who I actually was. Marcus grew up knowing his father had served in the military, a fact mentioned occasionally but never explored in any depth. Absorbed into his general understanding of me the way children absorb background facts about their parents, without any particular curiosity to investigate further, especially once I retired from active service and settled into what appeared, from the outside, to be an entirely ordinary civilian retirement, spending my days working in the garden Linda and I had built together, reading history, attending the occasional low-key gathering with a small circle of fellow veterans who understood, without needing explanation, exactly why certain conversations simply didn't happen at family dinner tables. I want to be fair to Marcus here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as cruel, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. Marcus grew up, in many ways, in the shadow of a father he understood only through his most visible, ordinary characteristics. A quiet, reserved man who worked a career Marcus never fully understood the shape of, who rarely discussed his professional life in any detail, who seemed, to a child and later a young man building his own understanding of ambition and success, fundamentally unremarkable compared to the more visibly successful fathers of some of his own childhood friends. Marcus built his own career in corporate sales, a field considerably more visible and immediately measurable than mine had ever been. Deals closed, commissions earned, promotions announced with fanfare among colleagues and friends. Over the years, I watched him develop, gradually, a particular narrative about my career and my life more broadly, one built entirely from the vague, unremarkable surface he'd had access to, a narrative that apparently calcified, over time, into genuine, dismissive judgment about what I'd actually accomplished with my working life. 2 months ago, Marcus hosted a barbecue at his house for several of his college friends who were in town for their reunion weekend, an event I wasn't specifically invited to, though I'd offered, the previous week, to lend him some folding chairs for the gathering, chairs he'd asked to borrow given the size of the group he was expecting. I drove over that Saturday afternoon simply to drop the chairs off, intending only a brief visit, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly meant to be a gathering for his own generation and his own friendships, rather than a family occasion requiring my extended presence. The afternoon was warm, and I could hear, even as I pulled into the driveway, the particular ambient sound of a backyard gathering in full swing, music playing softly, the low hum of multiple conversations, occasional bursts of laughter carrying over the fence. As I approached the side door near the kitchen, carrying the folding chairs, I heard voices through the open window, Marcus's voice among them, easy and relaxed, clearly several drinks into a comfortable afternoon with old friends. I want to tell you exactly what I heard, because the specific words matter to understanding everything that followed, and because I've replayed that exact exchange in my mind more times than I could count in the weeks since. Honestly, Marcus was saying, apparently continuing a conversation that had been unfolding for some time, my dad was basically a failure his whole life, if I'm being real about it. Spent almost 30 years doing some vague government job nobody could ever get a straight answer about. Never built anything, never really achieved anything I could point to and actually respect. I think growing up watching that taught me exactly what kind of life I didn't want to end up living, honestly. Some quiet, forgettable career that doesn't add up to much of anything by the time you're old. Several of his friends laughed, the easy, careless laughter of people amused by an offhand, confident observation rather than people who'd thought carefully about what they were actually laughing at. I stood there on that side porch, 75 years old, holding folding chairs, absorbing the particular sting of hearing my entire life's work, the 28 years, the Distinguished Service Cross sitting quietly in a drawer, the young officers I'd shaped whose subsequent decisions had saved countless lives across decades of conflicts I'd never personally witnessed. Reduced entirely to some vague government job and a failure his whole life, spoken plainly, confidently, to an audience of people whose opinion clearly mattered enormously to my son. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though some sting was certainly present. Men who've carried the particular weight I've carried since 1970 develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of dismissal without much visible reaction, a professional habit built from decades of keeping genuinely difficult things carefully contained. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, exhausted recognition of exactly how completely my own chosen decades of silence had shaped my own son's understanding of who I actually was, an understanding built entirely on absence rather than any real information, an absence I myself had constructed, brick by brick, across nearly 5 decades of deliberate discretion. I set the folding chairs down quietly by the door, didn't knock, and drove home in a silence that felt considerably heavier than the ordinary quiet of my usual solitary drives. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to why it carried the weight it eventually did. About 3 weeks after that barbecue, Marcus called me, his voice carrying a tone I didn't immediately recognize, something considerably more subdued than his usual confident, easy manner. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me, because something happened at work today that I honestly can't fully process on my own." He explained that his company had recently hired a new regional sales director, a man named General Marcus Ellison, retired from a distinguished military career before transitioning into corporate leadership, someone whose military background had been mentioned briefly during his introduction to the sales team, but not discussed in any real detail during that initial meeting. During a private conversation later that same day, apparently discussing some unrelated matter, my son had mentioned, in passing, his father's name, Thomas Whitfield, simply as a piece of small talk, and General Ellison's entire demeanor had shifted immediately and dramatically. "Dad," Marcus said, "he asked me directly if my father had served in Vietnam, if you'd been part of a specific unit he named precisely. And when I said yes, genuinely just confirming basic facts I barely understood myself, he got this look on his face I've genuinely never seen from anyone before. He told me, Dad, that Colonel Thomas Whitfield trained him personally, decades ago, when he was a young lieutenant, and that you'd received the Distinguished Service Cross for an action in 1970 that he says is still discussed, even now, as one of the most consequential examples of combat leadership under pressure that the Army has ever documented in official training materials. Dad, is that true? Is any of that actually true?" I sat with that question for a long moment, absorbing the particular strange symmetry of having my own silence finally cracked open, not by any deliberate choice of my own, but by pure, unplanned coincidence, a chance encounter between my son and a man whose own career I'd shaped decades earlier, without either of them having any idea of the connection until that exact conversation. "It's true," I said quietly. "All of it." There was a long, stunned silence on the line before Marcus spoke again, his voice noticeably unsteady now. "Dad, 3 weeks ago, at my barbecue, I told my friends you were basically a failure, that you'd never built anything worth respecting. I said that in your own kitchen window's hearing distance, Dad, and I've been feeling sick about it ever since, without even fully knowing why. And now I'm finding out from a stranger at work that you're apparently one of the most respected combat leaders this general has ever personally trained under." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Hearing my son's genuine shock, the particular disorientation of a man realizing that a narrative he'd built and confidently repeated for years, in front of an audience whose respect clearly mattered to him, had been entirely, fundamentally wrong. "Marcus," I said, "I heard what you said that afternoon. I was standing right outside the kitchen window when you said it." The silence on the line this time stretched even longer, and when Marcus finally spoke, his voice had broken entirely. "Dad, I am so sorry. I don't even know where to start. I've spent my entire life building this narrative about you being unremarkable, and I built it entirely out of the fact that you never talked about your career, and I never once considered that your silence might mean something completely different than what I'd assumed." We talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, Marcus driving over unannounced once he'd finished processing the initial shock of that phone call, sitting with me at my kitchen table, the same table where Linda and I had shared thousands of meals together, asking me, for the first time in his entire adult life, real questions about my actual career. I noticed, watching him across that table, a particular rawness in his expression that I hadn't seen from him since he was a much younger man, the specific look of someone confronting a fundamental miscalculation about something they'd assumed they understood completely. I told him, carefully, in pieces I'd genuinely never assembled out loud for anyone outside a small circle of fellow veterans, about that engagement in 1970, about Private Curtis Boyd, about the specific weight of the decisions I'd made under conditions that left almost no room for error. I watched Marcus's face as I described carrying that third wounded man across open ground, watched him absorb details about his own father that 39 years of being my son had never once given him access to. I told him about the training command years, about specific young officers whose subsequent careers I'd learned about only secondhand, over decades, occasional letters or chance encounters at veteran gatherings, informing me that a particular lesson I'd taught had shaped a decision that had, in turn, saved other lives in conflicts and circumstances I'd never personally witnessed. "Dad," Marcus said, near the end of that conversation, his eyes still red from what had clearly been considerable crying earlier in the evening, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this? Not the specifics necessarily, but even just the general shape of it. I've spent my whole life measuring you against some vague, unremarkable standard I built entirely out of your silence, and it turns out the actual truth was considerably more significant than almost anything I've built with my own career." His voice caught on that last sentence, and I could see him genuinely struggling with the full weight of what he was reconciling. Decades of a settled narrative suddenly, entirely upended. "I think," I said slowly, "I convinced myself, decades ago, that keeping that chapter separate from our family life was a kind of protection, sparing you and your mother from weight I didn't think either of you needed to carry. But I think, if I'm honest with myself now, the silence protected me more than it ever protected either of you, kept me from having to sit inside those memories out loud, in front of people I loved, watching their reactions. I think I mistook my own comfort for your protection, Marcus, and I'm sorry it took a chance conversation at your office for either of us to finally have this discussion properly. In the 2 months since that phone call, something has genuinely shifted in how Marcus relates to me. He calls now, real calls, not just obligatory check-ins, asking genuine questions about specific aspects of my service, about what it had actually felt like coming home from that particular war into a country that, like so many of my generation experienced, often treated our service with a particular discomfort rather than recognition. He arranged, 2 weeks ago, a proper introduction with General Ellison, sitting through nearly 3 hours of stories about the training program I'd once run, taking notes the way I remember him taking notes as a much younger man, back before whatever narrative he'd built about me had calcified into something considerably harder to shift. General Ellison, I'm told, spoke at length about the specific lessons he'd carried forward from my training command, decisions he'd made decades later in his own career that traced directly back to frameworks I'd taught him as a young lieutenant, details that visibly moved Marcus as he heard them articulated so specifically and so gratefully. Marcus has also started, I've learned from his own account, describing my career to his own colleagues and friends with an entirely different tone than the dismissive characterization from that barbecue. Something closer to genuine, if still somewhat general pride, understanding now, at least in broad strokes, exactly what those decades of silence had actually contained. He mentioned, during a recent visit, that he'd specifically gone back to the same friends who'd been present at that original barbecue, wanting to correct what he'd told them, a conversation he described as genuinely uncomfortable but necessary, given how confidently and publicly he'd originally dismissed my entire life's work in front of them. My granddaughter, Marcus's daughter Emily, 12 years old, has started asking me questions too, apparently having overheard enough of her father's changed conversation about me to become curious herself. She asked, during a recent visit, if I would tell her about the medal in the drawer, a request that caught me off guard given how carefully I'd kept that particular object out of general family awareness for over 5 decades. I showed it to her, carefully, explaining in age-appropriate terms what it represented, and I noticed her handling it with a seriousness that told me, even at 12 years old, she understood something significant about what she was looking at. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old soldier called a failure by his own son. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The people who love us sometimes build entire identities around incomplete understandings of who we actually are, not necessarily out of cruelty, but because we ourselves, for whatever reason, duty, discretion, simple habit, never gave them the material to understand any differently. That doesn't mean the real cost of that incompleteness isn't genuine. And it doesn't mean healing it happens instantly, the moment truth finally surfaces. It requires the harder, slower work of actually talking, conversation by conversation, until decades of silence finally give way to something considerably more honest. I spent nearly 5 decades being understood by my own son as an unremarkable man who never amounted to much beyond a forgettable career. It took an entirely unplanned coincidence, a chance workplace conversation between my son and a man I'd trained decades earlier, to finally crack open a silence I'd maintained since 1970, but it's taken the months since, conversation by conversation, for that crack to become the kind of genuine, lasting understanding that a single dramatic revelation alone could never fully provide on its own. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family whose full story you might not fully know, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe because we have a new story like this one every week.